In the heart of 15th century West Africa, while European kingdoms were still recovering from the Black Death and Renaissance artists were just beginning to paint their masterpieces, a teenage girl was doing something that would have been unthinkable in London, Paris, or Rome. She was commanding armies. She was conquering kingdoms. She was building an empire that would dwarf anything her European contemporaries could imagine. Her name was Amina, and by the time she died on a battlefield at over 50 years old, she had transformed a modest city-state into a military and economic superpower that controlled trade routes stretching across the entire Sahel region. This isn't a fairy tale. Queen Amina of Zaria was real. The walls she built still stand today. The trade routes she established shaped West African commerce for centuries. Yet for generations, her story was dismissed as myth, erased from history books, reduced to folklore and legend. But here's what they don't want you to know. The archaeological evidence, the contemporary chronicles, the physical structures that remain prove beyond doubt that Amina existed, and her story reveals something far more profound than just one woman's military genius. It exposes how deliberately history has been rewritten to erase African achievement, and how even the most magnificent empires can be lost to time if we don't fight to preserve their truth. Our story begins in a landscape that most people today couldn't even locate on a map, yet in the 15th century, it was one of the most sophisticated and wealthy regions on Earth, Hausaland. Picture this, a network of fortified city-states stretching across what is now northern Nigeria and southern Niger, each one a bustling center of commerce, Islamic scholarship, and political intrigue. These weren't primitive villages. These were urban centers with populations in the tens of thousands, with universities, mosques, markets that traded goods from as far away as Venice and Cairo, defensive walls that rivaled anything in medieval Europe. Imagine standing at the gates of Zaria in 1533. The city rises before you, surrounded by massive earthen walls, 20 feet high in places, stretching for miles in every direction. Inside those walls, the sounds of a thriving metropolis. Blacksmiths hammering iron into tools and weapons, weavers creating intricate textiles that would be worth fortunes in North African markets. Scholars debating points of Islamic law and philosophy, merchants haggling over caravans loaded with salt from the Sahara, gold from the southern forests, leather goods, slaves, exotic spices, and cola nuts. The smell of roasting meat mingles with incense, and the dust kicked up by thousands of feet, hooves, and wheels moving through crowded streets. This was the world into which Amina was born. Here's what made Zaria different from its neighboring city-states: geography. Zaria sat at the crossroads of multiple trade routes connecting the Sahara to the forest regions, the eastern kingdoms to the western empires. Control Zaria and you controlled commerce. Control commerce and you controlled wealth. Control wealth and you controlled power. The rulers of Zaria understood this better than anyone, and they had built their kingdom on the principle that economic dominance mattered more than territorial conquest, until Amina changed everything. She was born into the royal family around 1533, the daughter of King Nikitau and Queen Bakwa Tirunku. In Hausa society, royal women weren't relegated to domestic spheres. They owned property, they engaged in trade, they advised kings, but they didn't typically lead armies. They didn't personally command military campaigns. They didn't spend their childhoods training with weapons instead of learning the traditional feminine arts. Amina did. Contemporary accounts describe a girl who rejected every expectation placed upon her. While other royal daughters learned embroidery and household management, Amina studied military strategy with her father's generals. While they practiced traditional dances, she trained with spears, swords, and cavalry tactics. She chose the spear over the loom. And in a society that valued military prowess above almost everything else, her family didn't stop her. They encouraged her. But to understand how Amina would transform Zaria from a prosperous trading center into a military empire, we need to go back to the political landscape of Hausaland in the early 16th century. The region was divided into 7 major Hausa states, known as the Hausa Bakwai, or Hausa 7. Kano, Rano, Zaria, Gabir, Katsina, Dora, and Buram. Each was independent, each was constantly competing for trade dominance, and each was locked in an uneasy balance of power. Military conflicts were common but usually limited. Raids for slaves and tribute, yes. Total conquest and annexation, rare. The system worked because no single state had the military power to dominate the others completely. Wars were expensive. Maintaining large armies required resources that could be better spent on trade. And besides, the real wealth came not from conquering territory, but from controlling the merchants who moved through it. Tax the caravans, protect the trade routes, and the gold would flow into your treasury without the messy business of occupation and governance. This was the conventional wisdom that had governed Hausa politics for generations. Amina was about to shatter it completely. The year was 1549. Amina was 16 years old. Her mother, Queen Bakwatyrunku, had become ruler of Zaria after King Nikitau's death, proving that female rule wasn't unheard of in Hausa society. But Queen Bakwa ruled in the traditional way, cautiously, diplomatically, focusing on maintaining trade relationships and avoiding costly conflicts. She was a skilled administrator and a shrewd negotiator. Under her rule, Zaria prospered, but prosperity wasn't enough for Amina. She had spent her teenage years not in the royal palace but in military camps, riding with warriors, learning the arts of war from men who had spent decades fighting. She understood cavalry tactics, supply chain logistics, siege warfare, and psychological operations. More importantly, she understood something that her mother and the other traditional rulers didn't grasp. The old system was dying. Here's the fascinating part. While the House Estates were playing their careful diplomatic games, maintaining their balance of power, the world around them was changing dramatically. To the west, the Songhai Empire was expanding aggressively under Askia Muhammad. To the east, the Kanem-Bornu Empire was consolidating power and controlling more trade routes. To the north, North African states backed by Ottoman weapons were becoming more aggressive in their slave raiding. The old Hausa model of cooperative competition was becoming obsolete in an increasingly militarized region. Amina saw this. She understood that Zaria faced a choice: expand or be absorbed. When her mother died in 1549, Amina didn't hesitate. She claimed the throne immediately, and within months she had done something unprecedented. She mobilized Zaria's entire military force for a campaign of aggressive expansion. Not a raid, not a punitive expedition, a war of conquest. Her generals thought she was insane. Her advisors warned that she would bankrupt the kingdom. The neighboring states laughed at the idea of a 16-year-old girl leading armies. They stopped laughing very quickly. What Amina created wasn't just a military machine. It was a revolution in how West African warfare was conducted. First, she transformed Zaria's army from a traditional force of noble cavalry and conscripted infantry into a professional, standing military. She recruited warriors not just from Zaria but from throughout the region, paying them not with promises of plunder but with regular salaries. This gave her a disciplined, loyal force that didn't dissolve after each campaign season. It was expensive, yes, but it meant she could campaign year-round, something no other House estate could match. Second, she revolutionized cavalry tactics. The House estates had always relied on cavalry, but they used them primarily for raiding and skirmishing. Amina developed formations and tactics that turned cavalry into a devastating offensive weapon. She trained her horsemen to charge in coordinated waves, breaking enemy formations before the infantry even engaged. She used mounted archers to harass and weaken enemy positions before the main assault. She employed cavalry scouts to gather intelligence and map enemy territories before invasion. Third, and this is where her genius really shows, she understood logistics in a way that no other contemporary African military leader did. Armies move on their stomachs, and in the harsh Sahel environment, supply chains were everything. Amina established a network of supply depots, garrison towns, and fortified positions along her campaign routes. She didn't just conquer territory. She secured it, built infrastructure to hold it, and used it as a base for further expansion. But here's what most histories miss about Amina's early campaigns. She wasn't just conquering for glory or power. She was executing a carefully planned economic strategy. Every territory she conquered, she immediately fortified. And we're not talking about simple wooden palisades. Amina built walls, massive earthen fortifications, in some places 20 feet high and equally thick, surrounded by defensive ditches. These walls served multiple purposes. They protected the newly conquered territories from counterattack. They established Zaria's permanent presence and authority. They secured trade routes and market towns, and they sent an unmistakable message: Zaria was here to stay. Contemporary chroniclers reported that Amina built walls around every major town she conquered. Modern archaeologists have confirmed this. Across northern Nigeria, there are ancient earthen fortifications known locally as Ganuwar Amina, Amina's walls. Some of them still stand today, over 450 years later, testament to the scale of her building projects. Picture the scene: a conquered city, its gates thrown open, its warriors defeated. Amina's forces occupy the town, but instead of simple garrison troops, engineers arrive. Thousands of laborers, both free workers and enslaved captives, begin the massive work of constructing fortifications. The earth is excavated from deep trenches, forming both the wall material and defensive moats simultaneously. The walls rise foot by foot, week by week, until they encircle the entire settlement. Guard towers are positioned at strategic intervals. Gates are reinforced with timber and iron. Within months, what was once a vulnerable town has become a fortress, a permanent extension of Zaria's power. And Amina wasn't finished. Inside those walls, she established markets, guaranteed safe passage for merchants, and offered protection to traders who paid taxes to Zaria. She turned conquered territories into profit centers, using the wealth they generated to fund further expansion. It was conquest that paid for itself. Over the following 3 years, Amina launched campaign after campaign. She moved south toward the forest regions, securing access to the gold-producing areas. She pushed north toward the Sahara trade routes, controlling the salt caravans. She expanded east and west, absorbing smaller city-states and forcing larger ones into tributary relationships. By 1552, at just 19 years old, she had transformed Zaria from a mid-sized trading city into the dominant military power in Hausaland. But the real crisis was internal. Everything Amina had achieved had been accomplished through constant warfare and massive military spending. Her strategy worked brilliantly as long as she kept winning, kept conquering new territories that generated enough wealth to fund the next campaign. But what happened when there were no more easy conquests? What happened when she faced enemies who had learned from her tactics and built defenses against them? What happened when the cost of maintaining her empire began to exceed the wealth it generated? These were questions that Amina's advisors raised constantly. Her response was always the same: expand faster. This brings us to the most controversial and misunderstood aspect of Amina's reign, the one that later historians would use to dismiss her as legend rather than fact: her relationships with men. According to multiple historical accounts, Amina never married. Instead, she took male consorts, lovers from among the conquered peoples or sometimes from her own warriors. She would spend a night with them, and then, in the morning, she would have them executed. Historians today debate whether this actually happened or whether it was propaganda, either by her enemies to portray her as a monster or by her supporters to enhance her legendary status as a woman who dominated men completely. But here's what we know for certain. Amina never married, never produced an heir, and never allowed any man to claim power through a relationship with her. In a society where marriage alliances were one of the primary tools of diplomacy and where royal lineages were everything, this was revolutionary and terrifying to traditional power structures. Whether she actually executed her lovers or not, the story reveals something true about how Amina wielded power. She refused to let her gender be used to control her. She refused to let marriage become a weakness or a tool for ambitious men to manipulate. She refused to play by anyone's rules but her own, and that refusal made her enemies. By the mid-1550s, Amina had been ruling Zaria for nearly a decade. She had expanded the kingdom's territory by several 100%. She controlled trade routes that generated enormous wealth. She commanded a professional army that had never been defeated in a major engagement. She was, by any measure, one of the most successful military leaders in African history. But here's where the story becomes almost mythical in its scope. Amina didn't stop. She didn't consolidate her gains and shift to peaceful administration. She didn't negotiate marriage alliances to secure her position diplomatically. She didn't transition from warrior queen to administrative ruler. She kept fighting, campaign after campaign, year after year, for over 3 decades. The year was 1565. Amina had been ruling for 16 years, and she launched what would become one of her most ambitious campaigns, pushing north toward the Sahara and the lucrative trans-Saharan trade routes. These routes, carrying salt, gold, slaves, and luxury goods between West Africa and North Africa, represented unimaginable wealth. Controlling them meant controlling the economic lifeblood of the entire region, but the northern territories were different from the house estates Amina had conquered earlier. The peoples living near the Sahara, groups like the Tuareg and various Berber tribes, were nomadic or semi-nomadic. They couldn't be conquered and occupied in the traditional sense. They had no cities to fortify, no fixed populations to tax. They could simply move away from her armies, then return once she left. Amina adapted her strategy. Instead of trying to conquer the nomadic peoples directly, she established fortified trading posts and garrison towns along the major routes. These served as both military bases and commercial centers, places where caravans could rest safely, resupply, and pay taxes to Zaria for the privilege of protection. It was a brilliant solution to the problem of controlling territory that couldn't be permanently occupied. Contemporary accounts describe these fortified trading posts as small cities in themselves, wells dug deep into the sandy soil to ensure water supplies, warehouses for storing trade goods, barracks for garrison troops, mosques for the Muslim traders who dominated trans-Saharan commerce, markets where goods from across Africa and the Mediterranean world changed hands, and always Amina's walls, massive fortifications that made these posts nearly impregnable to raiders. By establishing these posts, Amina did something unprecedented in West African history. She extended Hausaland's power beyond the traditional boundaries of the house estates and into the Sahara itself. She didn't just control trade routes. She became a major player in trans-Saharan commerce, competing with North African kingdoms and even indirectly with Mediterranean powers. Visualize the scale of what she had built. From the forest regions in the south, where gold was mined and brought north, to the Sahara in the north, where salt caravans originated, from the western borders of Hausaland to the eastern kingdoms. All of it secured by Amina's fortifications, patrolled by her armies, and generating tax revenue that flowed into Zaria's treasury. At its height, Amina's empire covered an area larger than many European kingdoms, with a population in the millions and wealth that would be equivalent to billions of dollars in today's economy. But here's the fascinating part. Amina wasn't building this empire for personal wealth or dynastic ambition. She had no heirs, she had no plans to found a lasting ruling house. So why did she do it? The answer reveals something profound about her character and her vision. Amina seems to have believed that only through constant expansion and military dominance could Zaria, and by extension Hausaland, remain independent and prosperous in an increasingly dangerous world. She saw the empires rising around her, the Songhai to the west, Kanem-Bornu to the east, and she understood that small, divided states would eventually be absorbed by larger, more aggressive neighbors. Her solution was to make Zaria the largest and most aggressive of all. If you're still here, this story is about to take a darker turn, so don't forget to hit that subscribe button, because what happens next will show you how even the most brilliant military strategy can't protect against the enemy within. So stay tuned. The year was 1575. Amina had been ruling for 26 years. Her empire was at its peak, her army was undefeated, and trade wealth was flowing into Zaria at unprecedented levels. She was in her early 40s, still personally leading military campaigns, still expanding her territory. To outside observers, Zaria appeared unstoppable. But the very thing that made Amina successful now made her vulnerable. Her entire system depended on constant military success. The army required enormous resources to maintain. The fortifications required constant repairs and garrisoning. The trade routes required active patrolling to keep them safe from raiders. All of this was expensive, and the only way to pay for it was through the wealth generated by the empire itself. As long as the empire kept growing, kept absorbing new territories and their tax revenues, the system worked. But by 1575, Amina was running out of easy conquests. She had absorbed most of the smaller house estates. The remaining major powers, like Kano and Katsina, were now alert to the threat she posed and had strengthened their defenses. The northern territories were secured but generated less revenue than the effort required to hold them. The southern forests were difficult terrain for cavalry warfare and were defended by kingdoms with their own sophisticated military traditions. Amina was facing the problem that has destroyed every expanding empire throughout history: overextension. Her advisors, the ones who hadn't been executed or exiled for questioning her decisions, warned her repeatedly: consolidate, shift from expansion to administration. build civilian infrastructure instead of military installations, negotiate peace treaties with neighboring powers, create stable succession plans. She ignored them all. For Amina, stopping meant dying. Not physically perhaps, though she would eventually die on a battlefield, but dying in terms of relevance and power. She had built her entire identity, her entire reign, on being the warrior queen who never stopped fighting. How could she suddenly become an administrator, a bureaucrat, a keeper of the peace? She couldn't, so she didn't. Instead, she launched new campaigns into increasingly difficult territories, fighting enemies who had learned to counter her tactics, spending resources that Zaria couldn't afford to lose. And slowly, invisibly at first, the empire began to fracture. It started with the tributary states. These were kingdoms that Amina had forced into submission, but not directly conquered and annexed. They paid tribute to Zaria, they accepted Zaria's military dominance, but they maintained their own rulers and their own internal autonomy. As long as Amina's army was visibly powerful and close by, they paid. But as her forces became stretched thin across an enormous territory, constantly campaigning in distant regions, the tributary states began to calculate, what if we just stop paying? What if Amina is too busy fighting in the north to send an army south to punish us? What if we're not the only ones thinking this way, and Amina suddenly faces multiple rebellions simultaneously? The calculations proved correct. By the late 1570s, tributary states across the empire were withholding payments, testing Zaria's response. When Amina sent forces to punish some rebels, others took advantage of her absence to rebel elsewhere. It was the classic problem of imperial overstretch, and Amina had no good solution. She could have pulled back, abandoned the more distant and less profitable territories, shortened her defensive lines, and focused on holding the core of the empire. But that would have been an admission of failure, a retreat, and Amina didn't retreat. Instead, she intensified her campaigns, trying to crush rebellions through sheer military force and terrify potential rebels into submission. It worked, but at a terrible cost. Her army, once well-paid and disciplined, began to suffer from irregular payments and difficult conditions. Soldiers started deserting. Unit cohesion declined. The quality of her military force, the weapon that had built her empire, began to erode. But the real crisis was economic. The constant campaigning was draining Zaria's treasury faster than even successful conquests could replenish it. Trade revenues were declining as merchants began to avoid routes that passed through unstable, rebellious territories. The garrison towns and fortified trading posts required constant resupply and reinforcement, but the resources to maintain them were disappearing. By the early 1580s, Amina was ruling an empire that existed more on paper and reputation than on actual control. Large portions of her conquered territories were effectively independent, paying tribute only sporadically or not at all. Her army, though still formidable, was a shadow of its former strength. Her treasury was depleted, and she was now in her late 40s or early 50s, an age that in the 16th century was considered elderly, especially for someone who had spent decades campaigning in harsh conditions. A wise ruler would have recognized reality, would have negotiated a settlement, ensured a stable succession, and preserved at least some of the empire's achievements for future generations. Amina launched another campaign. When the final campaign finally happened, nobody could have predicted how it would end. Or perhaps everyone did, and they simply didn't dare say it aloud. It was approximately 1583. Historical records from this period are fragmentary, but what we can piece together is this. Amina received reports that a coalition of rebellious tributary states in the southern territories was forming an army to march on Zaria itself. This wasn't just another local rebellion. This was an existential threat. Despite her age, despite her military's weakened condition, despite warnings from every advisor who still dared speak to her, Amina personally led the army south to confront the rebels. She would not send generals to fight her battles. She would not negotiate from a position of perceived weakness. She would do what she had always done, lead from the front, inspire her warriors through her personal courage, and crush her enemies through superior tactics and will. The campaign began poorly. Her army, moving through territories that had once been firmly under Zaria's control, found hostile populations and burned villages. The rebels had learned from Amina's own tactics, using scorched earth policies to deny her forces supplies. Supply lines from Zaria stretched thin and became vulnerable to raids. Warriors who had once feared Amina's reputation now saw an aging queen leading a tired, hungry army into increasingly dangerous territory. The details of the final battle are lost to history. We don't know exactly where it occurred, who commanded the rebel forces, or how large the armies were. What we know comes from oral traditions, passed down through generations, and from the fact that Amina never returned to Zaria. She died on the battlefield. Whether she was killed in combat, cut down while personally leading a charge in the manner she had always fought, or whether she died from wounds sustained in battle, or even from illness or exhaustion during the campaign, we can't say with certainty. But this much is clear: Queen Amina of Zaria, the warrior queen who had ruled for over 30 years, who had built an empire through military genius and unstoppable will, died as she had lived, fighting. Here's the shocking truth that most histories don't tell you. Amina's death didn't just end her reign, it effectively ended her empire. She had never married, never produced heirs, and never created a stable succession plan. Her entire system of rule had been built around her personal military leadership and force of will. When she died, there was no one capable of holding it together. What followed was chaos. Multiple claimants to the throne of Zaria, each backed by different factions of the military and aristocracy. The tributary states immediately declared independence. Neighboring kingdoms that had feared Zaria's power saw an opportunity and launched their own invasions, trying to seize territory while Zaria was weak. The empire that Amina had spent 34 years building disintegrated in less than a decade. This wasn't just a political collapse. It was a systematic destruction of everything Amina had created. The fortifications remained, but they were now occupied by local rulers who had no loyalty to Zaria. The trade routes remained, but they were now controlled by the same kingdoms that Amina had once dominated. The wealth remained, but it now flowed into other treasuries. It was as if Amina's reign had been erased, leaving only physical ruins as evidence it had ever existed. But the most shocking part of this story is what happened to Amina's memory. Over the following decades, as new powers rose and fell in Hausaland, as Islam spread and transformed local cultures, as European colonial powers began their initial contacts with West Africa, Amina's story began to change. The historical figure became confused with legend and myth. The real queen who had built walls and commanded armies became a fairy tale character, a symbolic figure representing female power and resistance, but not a real historical person. By the time Europeans began seriously documenting West African history in the 19th century, Amina had been almost completely erased from the historical record. European scholars, operating from the racist assumption that Africans had no history worth recording and that African women certainly could never have been military leaders, dismissed Amina as pure folklore. They claimed that the stories of her conquests were impossible exaggerations. They argued that the walls attributed to her must have been built by men, probably over many generations, and were only associated with Amina through later mythmaking. This wasn't just ignorance, it was deliberately systematic erasure. European colonial powers had a vested interest in portraying Africa as historically primitive, ungoverned by strong states, and lacking sophisticated military or political traditions. Acknowledging that a 16th-century West African woman had built an empire and commanded armies would have contradicted the entire colonial narrative that presented European rule as a civilizing mission bringing order to chaos. So Amina was forgotten. Or rather, she was deliberately ignored, her achievements denied, her very existence questioned. For over 3 centuries, she remained buried in folklore, her walls standing as silent testimony to a truth that official histories refused to acknowledge. For over 400 years, Queen Amina was essentially erased from serious historical discourse, remembered in Nigeria through oral traditions and folk songs, but absent from academic histories and completely unknown outside West Africa. Her story was taught to Nigerian children as legend, not history, as myth, not fact. Beautiful and inspiring perhaps, but not real, not proven, not documented in the way that European historians demanded documentation. It wasn't until the mid-20th century that serious scholarly work began to resurrect Amina's true story. Nigerian historians, working after independence and determined to reclaim their nation's history from colonial distortions, began systematically collecting oral traditions, analyzing archaeological evidence, and searching for contemporary written sources. What they discovered was stunning. The walls were real. Massive earthen fortifications scattered across northern Nigeria, exactly where oral tradition said Amina had built them. Carbon dating and architectural analysis confirmed they dated to the 16th century. Local traditions in dozens of towns consistently attributed them to Queen Amina, using the specific term Ganuwar Amina that had been passed down through generations. Contemporary written sources existed. Arabic chronicles from North African scholars and traders who had visited Hausaland in the 16th and 17th centuries. References to a powerful woman ruler in Zaria, descriptions of military campaigns led by a queen. These sources had always existed, but European scholars had either ignored them or dismissed them as unreliable because they contradicted the colonial narrative. Archaeological evidence of a sophisticated 16th century kingdom in Zaria. Trade goods from across Africa and the Mediterranean, weapons and armor indicating a well-equipped military force, infrastructure suggesting a wealthy, organized state, all of it consistent with oral traditions about Amina's reign. Today, as we're recovering and properly analyzing this evidence, we're not just rehabilitating one woman's reputation. We're confronting the systematic way that African history has been distorted, minimized, and erased. Amina's story forces us to ask uncomfortable questions. How many other African achievements have been dismissed as myths? How much history has been lost not through time but through deliberate suppression? What other stories are waiting to be uncovered once we're willing to look past colonial-era prejudices? The truth is that pre-colonial Africa was home to sophisticated kingdoms, brilliant leaders, and military achievements that rival anything in European or Asian history. Amina wasn't an exception. She was one example among many of African excellence that has been hidden from global consciousness through centuries of racism and colonial propaganda. Today, in modern Nigeria, Queen Amina is celebrated as a national hero. Her image appears on currency. Schools and streets are named after her. Monuments honor her achievements. The walls she built are protected as cultural heritage sites. Nigerians know her story, teach it to their children, and claim her as proof of their ancestors' greatness. But outside Nigeria, outside West Africa, she remains largely unknown. Ask a random person in Europe or North America to name a famous African queen, and they might think of Cleopatra, who was ethnically Greek and ruled an Egypt that was culturally Mediterranean. Ask them about Queen Amina, and you'll likely get blank stares. This is the final erasure. Not denying her existence anymore, the evidence is too strong, but containing her significance, keeping her story local rather than universal, treating her as an interesting regional figure rather than a world historical leader who deserves to be taught alongside Elizabeth I, Catherine the Great, or any other powerful woman ruler. Amina's legacy endures in every wall that still bears her name, in every Nigerian girl who learns that her ancestors produced warrior queens, in every scholar who refuses to let African history remain buried. She reminds us that greatness can emerge anywhere, but even the most magnificent achievements can be lost if we don't work to preserve them. Her story is a testament to what one person can accomplish through vision, courage, and unstoppable will. But it's also a warning about how easily history can be rewritten by those who control the narrative. The walls still stand. The trade routes she secured shaped West African commerce for centuries after her death. The kingdom she built, though it fractured after she died, established Zaria as a major power in Hausaland that would endure for generations. And the memory of a warrior queen who refused to accept any limitations on what she could achieve continues to inspire people who hear her story today. Queen Amina of Zaria conquered kingdoms, built walls that have survived 5 centuries, and commanded armies in an era when women rulers were rare anywhere in the world. She did all of this while being African, while being a woman, while coming from a place that Europeans would later dismiss as primitive and historyless. Her existence challenges every assumption about who gets to be great, whose stories matter, and what counts as real history. If this story opened your eyes to how much African history has been hidden from mainstream education, hit that like button and subscribe for more documentaries that uncover the truth about civilizations and leaders that have been deliberately erased from the historical record. Let me know in the comments what other African queens, kings, and empires you think deserve to have their stories told with the same depth and respect that we give to European and Asian history. Because here's what I've learned researching Amina's story: Africa's history isn't less sophisticated or less impressive than anywhere else on Earth. It's just been less told. And every time we uncover one of these buried stories, we're not just learning about the past. We're correcting centuries of lies and reclaiming a heritage that colonialism tried to destroy. The truth is always more incredible than fiction. You just have to know where to look for it. And sometimes you have to be willing to look past everything you've been taught to believe about who makes history and whose achievements count as real. Queen Amina made history. Her walls prove it. Her story survives. And now you know the truth about one of Africa's greatest warrior queens.